Hey, welcome back to Epic Ranking. Today, we're diving into a list that's bound to ruffle some feathers. Games that, despite all the love they've gotten, just didn't hit the mark for me personally. These aren't bad games at all, but they're ones that, for one reason or another, didn't stick the landing, in my opinion. So, here are the top 20 overrated games. Let's jump in. Let's start with Grand Theft Auto 4. Now, I get it, GTA 4 is supposed to be this huge leap in the open world genre, but for me, it's probably the least fun I've had in a GTA game. Liberty City is impressive in its detail, but it's also gray, bleak, and honestly, just kind of depressing to wander through. Nico Bellic is a compelling character, sure, but the whole experience felt too serious. After the over-the-top chaos of San Andreas, GTA 4 just felt like it was taking itself too seriously. The constant phone calls from friends nagging me to go bowling? Yeah, that didn't help either. It's a good game, but I never felt the need to revisit it the way I do with other GTA titles. It just didn't have that fun factor I crave in an open-world game. But, hey, that's just me. Look, I love pirates as much as anyone, and the idea of blending an Assassin's Creed game with naval combat sounds amazing on paper. And for the first few hours, it is. Sailing the high seas, commanding your ship, and blasting away enemy vessels is a blast at first. But after a while, I realized that beyond the pirate fantasy, Black Flag is just more of the same AC formula, climbing towers, tailing enemies, and repetitive missions. It felt like the pirate theme was doing all the heavy lifting, while the actual gameplay was just recycled from earlier games. Edward Kenway never grabbed me as a protagonist either. Compared to Ezio or even Altair, he felt a little flat. It's a fun game, but I don't see why it's often considered the best Assassin's Creed. For me, the novelty wore off quickly. Rogue is basically the forgotten middle child of the Assassin's Creed series. It's not bad, but it's very much a smaller, less impactful version of Black Flag. You're sailing again, which is cool, but after playing Black Flag, it all felt too familiar. The story of Shay Cormac turning against the Assassins to join the Templars could have been amazing, but it never fully capitalizes on that concept. I kept waiting for something to hook me, but it just felt like I was replaying the same game with a slight twist. It's not a bad experience, but it never gave me that sense of excitement or tension I look for in an AC game. It's solid, but for me, it was just too much of the same. I know some people love it, but for me, it didn't stick. I know Arkham City is hailed as one of the best superhero games ever, but honestly, it didn't click with me as much as Arkham Asylum. Don't get me wrong, gliding through Gotham and beating up thugs as Batman is fun, but the open-world design felt a bit empty to me. The tight, claustrophobic atmosphere of Arkham Asylum kept me engaged, whereas Arkham City felt too spread out, with side missions that never grabbed my attention. The game throws a lot of villains at you, but I found the story unfocused. It felt like it was trying to do too much, and as a result, I never got as attached to any of the villains or the plot. For me, it's a good game, but nowhere near as tight or satisfying as its predecessor. This one is tough because I really wanted to like A Plague Tale Requiem. The atmosphere is amazing, the setting is dark and beautiful, and the story has heart. But after a few hours of sneaking around and throwing rocks at guards, the gameplay started to feel really repetitive. I love the idea of blending stealth with a narrative-driven experience, but it felt like the game was running out of ideas halfway through. The story is strong, but the gameplay didn't evolve enough to keep me fully engaged. I was more invested in the cutscenes than the actual playing, and for a game that's supposed to immerse you in its world, that's a problem. It's a decent experience, but personally, it didn't leave the lasting impact I was hoping for. I'm all for cinematic games, but Beyond Two Souls took it to a level where it felt like I was barely playing a game. It's more of an interactive movie, and while Ellen Page and Willem Dafoe give fantastic performances, The narrative jumps around so much that I found it hard to stay invested. One minute, I'm playing a teenager, the next, I'm an adult on a CIA mission, and then I'm a homeless person, all without much explanation. The whole choices matter angle doesn't really play out in a meaningful way either. The story plays out mostly the same no matter what you do, so it felt like my decisions didn't matter much. It's a pretty game with strong acting, but as an actual game, it didn't pull me in. It's one of those experiences that's cool to watch, but not nearly as fun to play. Okay, I know this is going to be controversial, but Elden Ring didn't grab me the way it did for so many others. Yes, the open world is absolutely stunning, and the freedom to explore is incredible, but the Soulsborne combat is still as punishing as ever. For a lot of people, that's the charm, but for me, it became frustrating. The lack of guidance in such a massive world left me wandering aimlessly at times, and the constant brutal difficulty spikes took away some of the enjoyment. It's a beautifully crafted game, no doubt, but I found myself more stressed than excited to play. I know it's a masterpiece for many, but personally, it didn't connect with me like other games in the genre. When I first saw the trailers for Black Myth: Wukong, I was blown away. The graphics were incredible, the combat looked slick, and the mythological setting was unique. But after playing it, I realized that beyond the stunning visuals, the gameplay didn't offer much that I hadn't seen before. It's got that Soulsborne level of difficulty, but without the same level of satisfaction after beating a tough boss. The world is beautiful, but the story didn't grab me as much as I wanted it to, and after a while, the combat felt repetitive. It's an impressive game, don't get me wrong, but I think it's praised more for how it looks than how it plays. It just didn't pull me in the way I'd hoped. I appreciate Baldur's Gate 3 for its depth, but man, this game is slow. The writing is excellent and the world is well crafted, but the turn-based combat and the sheer scale of the game make it feel like a marathon. I get that it's meant to be a deep RPG experience, but I found myself losing patience with the slow pace. Every battle feels like it takes forever, and while I love a good tactical challenge, it didn't always feel rewarding. It's a game that requires a lot of investment, and for some, that's perfect. But for me, it was just too much. It's undeniably well made, but I don't think it's the flawless RPG people make it out to be. Here's where I get into tricky territory. The Last of Us is often regarded as one of the greatest games of all time, and while I absolutely understand the praise, it's an emotional roller coaster with fantastic acting and a deeply human story. It didn't click with me as much as it seems to for others. For starters, the gameplay is pretty standard for a third-person action adventure. There's stealth, crafting, and a lot of sneaking around, but none of it felt particularly groundbreaking. And as much as I loved the characters of Joel and Ellie, I sometimes felt that the story relied a bit too much on pulling at heartstrings in obvious ways. It's a good game, no doubt, but for me, it never felt as revolutionary as people say. By the end, I was more emotionally exhausted than satisfied, and it didn't make me want to replay it. I get why people love it, but personally, it didn't grab me the way I thought it would. Overrated? In my opinion, yeah, a little. I respect Dark Souls 3 for what it is, a polished, challenging entry in the Souls series, but for me, it felt like more of the same. The combat is tight and rewarding, but after playing Dark Souls and Bloodborne, this one didn't offer much that felt truly fresh. The world is beautifully designed, but the story remains as cryptic as ever, which for some is a selling point, but for me, it left me feeling disconnected from the world I was supposed to be saving. It's still a good game, but after the innovation of Bloodborne and the charm of the original Dark Souls, this one felt like it was trying to recapture old magic rather than push the series forward. I enjoyed it, but I didn't fall in love with it the way others did. It's good, but a little overrated in my book. Here's a game that's universally loved, and while I can absolutely see why, it didn't quite blow me away. Don't get me wrong, Kratos' journey from rage-filled god to a more reserved, reflective father is powerful, and the relationship between him and Atreus is beautifully done. But the gameplay felt slower and more methodical compared to the bombastic chaos of the earlier God of War games. The open-world elements, while cool, felt a bit padded at times, with too many collectibles and side activities that didn't add much. It's a fantastic game, but personally, it felt a bit like a departure from what made the original series so fun. I respect the direction they took with Kratos, but it didn't hook me as much as I hoped it would. A great game? Absolutely. One of the best of all time? Not quite for me. As a massive Star Wars fan, I was hyped for Fallen Order, but after playing through it, I walked away feeling a bit underwhelmed. Don't get me wrong, the lightsaber combat is solid, and the story is serviceable, but the platforming sections felt clunky, and the game's attempts at Soulsborne-style combat didn't feel as tight as I wanted them to. There's a lot of backtracking, and sometimes the game's map design made it more frustrating than fun to explore. It's definitely one of the better Star Wars games we've had in years, but for me, it didn't quite deliver the epic single-player Star Wars experience I was hoping for. I had fun, but it didn't blow me away. For a game that gets so much love, it's a little overrated in my opinion. I'll start by saying that Bioshock Infinite is visually stunning, and the floating city of Columbia is one of the most memorable settings in gaming. But as much as I enjoyed the aesthetic and the early moments of the game, the story quickly spirals into a convoluted mess. It starts off strong, exploring themes of racism and American exceptionalism, but then it takes a sharp turn into multiverse theory. And by the end, it feels like it's trying too hard to be deep and mind-bending without giving players a satisfying payoff. The combat, while fun at times, also becomes repetitive, and the overall experience left me feeling more confused than engaged. It's a game that gets a lot of praise for its ambition, but for me, the story fell apart, and the gameplay didn't do enough to keep me invested. It's good, but not the masterpiece it's often hailed as. Overwatch is undeniably fun. There's no denying that. The colorful characters, tight team-based gameplay, and fast-paced matches make it a blast to play, especially with friends. But after playing it for a while, I started to realize how repetitive it became. The core loop of pushing the payload or capturing objectives didn't offer enough variety for me to stay invested long-term, and balance issues often made certain characters feel frustrating to play against. It's still a great multiplayer shooter, but for a game that's often hailed as the pinnacle of team-based games, I think it's lost a bit of its magic. It's fun in bursts, but for me, it never became the multiplayer obsession it seems to be for others. Good, but a bit overrated in my opinion. This one hurts a bit because I love the Metal Gear series, but the Phantom Pain felt like a step back in some ways. The open-world sandbox is amazing, and the freedom to approach missions however you want is great, but the story feels unfinished. Metal Gear games are known for their deep, convoluted plots, but here it felt like the narrative just fizzled out halfway through. Kojima's signature storytelling was missing, and for a game that's supposed to be the grand finale, it felt oddly incomplete. The gameplay is fantastic, but without the strong narrative to back it up, it felt like something was missing. It's a good game, but as a Metal Gear fan, I was left wanting more. For me, it's overrated. Before you grab your pitchforks, let me explain. I think The Witcher 3 is a great RPG. The world is beautifully crafted, the writing is top-notch, and Geralt is an iconic character. But the gameplay? It's not as tight as other RPGs. The combat feels clunky, and there's a lot of padding in the form of fetch quests and filler content. The open world is massive, but not every part of it feels meaningful to explore. I love the story and the characters, but I found myself getting bored with the actual gameplay at times. It's still one of the best RPGs out there, but for a game that's often called the greatest of all time, I think it's got more flaws than people like to admit. It's fantastic, but a little overrated in my opinion. I have a lot of fond memories of Fallout 3, but replaying it years later, it definitely hasn't aged as well as I'd hoped. The world is huge, but it often feels barren, with long stretches of nothing in between points of interest. The combat is clunky, and the VAT system, while cool at first, quickly becomes a crutch to get through the game's stiff shooting mechanics. The story is solid, but it doesn't have the same depth or impact as New Vegas. It's a good game, and I understand why it's a fan favorite, but personally, I think it's a bit overrated compared to other RPGs from the same era. It's fun, but it feels a little dated. No Man's Sky has come a long way since its disastrous launch, and I give credit to the developers for turning it around. But even now, after all the updates, I still find it hard to get fully invested in the game. The universe is massive, but after you've visited a handful of planets, they all start to blur together. The core gameplay loop of gathering resources and upgrading your ship is fun for a while, but after a few hours, it starts to feel repetitive. I appreciate the ambition behind No Man's Sky, but even in its current state, it doesn't hold my attention for long. It's a relaxing game, but for something that's supposed to be this endless universe of exploration, it feels surprisingly shallow. For me, it's a bit overrated. And finally, we come to Minecraft. I get it. Minecraft is beloved by millions and has become a cultural phenomenon. But for me, it never clicked. The sandbox nature of the game is amazing, and the creativity it inspires is undeniable. But I personally never felt the urge to keep playing. Building massive structures or exploring randomly generated worlds just didn't hold my attention the way it does for so many others. It's a fantastic platform for creativity, but as a game, I always found it a bit lacking. It's great for people who love open-ended experiences, but personally, I prefer a bit more structure in my games. I know this is probably the most unpopular opinion on the list, but Minecraft just isn't for me. Overrated? In my opinion, yes. And there you have it. The top 20 overrated games. Again, this is all just my opinion, and I know a lot of these games are beloved by many. But hey, gaming is personal, and sometimes the most popular games just don't land for everyone. What games do you think are overrated? Let us know in the comments. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell for more epic rankings. Until next time, this is Epic Ranking signing off.